There you go. All right. Well, thank you guys so much, and welcome everyone watching, and also those watching maybe in the recording in the future. We're very, very lucky to bring you an amazing panel of speakers on a very timely topic, which is I think probably the central question of our times, the opportunity and challenges that US and China will have to navigate in their bid to work together for climate change. And we are hosting this during the New York Climate Week 2021, right before the General Assembly and also before COP coming up soon. And I'm joined here by an amazing panel of speakers who I think each has a unique and very precious perspective on the opportunity and challenges of the US-China relationship. So first is Ms. Annie Liang. She is the co-founder of Liang Capital Partners, a multi-family office focused on social and environmental impact. She also is engaged in cross-border sustainable business strategy and a member of the founding team of the US-China Green Fund. Annie is the granddaughter of China's first environmentalist, Liang, who founded the Friends of Nature, an advocate of sustainable development and environmental protection, and works with relevant governments, companies, and nonprofit institutions across the US-China relationship, especially in sustainability and impact investments. She also runs a small nonprofit that focuses on environmental education and actions and serves on the young advisory boards of several nonprofits that are at the nexus between climate change, education, and culture. So welcome, Annie. Next, we have Professor Kary Korinsky. He is the co-founder of the Sustainable Finance Institute, the author of Modern China. He's a lecturer at both Brown and also University, and co-founded the Sustainable Finance Institute, which hosts a successful symposium in 2019 at the Peking University HSBC Business School in Shenzhen. And he's very interested in spreading the awareness and fostering communication of positive, sustainable, and impact investments across Asia, which now represents about half of the world's economy. Professor Karinsky also served for 10 plus years as the lead consultant of the UNPRI Climate Change Asset Owner Strategy Project, and has a deep vantage view into the way that asset managers think about and invest in climate-related activities. And last but not least, we have Mr. Colin Tam, who's the chairman of Crystal Vision Energy, and also a member of the GLG Council as well. He is an expert in renewable energy and related technologies, and also significant business development between the United States, China, and the BRI countries. He serves as the chairman of HAESCO, and also the IPPF forum, and forms a number of JVs between large shareholders like PSEG, Hydro-Quebec, and IIF to build, develop, and operate more than 18 independent power producing facilities in China, one in Korea, one in Taiwan, and has sold actually a business in 2017 for more than $600 million. He created double-digit returns for shareholders, and previously served as the president of PSEG Asia and also director of air products and chemicals. So Mr. Colin has extensive experience in energy development and also in mega finance deals between the two borders of US and China. So with that as a brief introduction, myself, I am the founder and CEO of Carbonbase. We're serving as your moderator today. And very excited things off. So we'll start with a few prepared remarks and some illustrated slides from Annie, and then we'll launch into our general panel discussion. Annie, over to you.
Thank you so much, Max, and thanks for having me on this panel. I'm really honored to be here amongst distinguished panelists to share my perspectives. So I just wanted to share a few slides. Just see. Can everybody see that?
Yes, yes, we can.
Great. So I just wanted to kind of put this in context. What we're speaking about today is really about US-China climate action opportunities. Since the historic Paris Agreement and other developed nations have announced plans to cut emissions and limit global warming to below 2 degrees Celsius. And with leading countries aiming to reach global peak emissions by 2030, I think we're seeing a lot of opportunities, especially in addressing the sustainable development goals. And so while we've witnessed some setbacks in the US-China relationship, which was really exacerbated by the global pandemic, both the US and China realized that they need to mobilize public and private sector financing to reach net zero emissions and build a more resilient future. So this means allocating more government budgets towards innovation, including carbon capture and sequestration, renewable energy infrastructure, energy storage, et cetera. Just to cite some of the recent advancements and commitments, we've heard from China that it has committed to achieving carbon neutrality by 2060. And currently, just to give everyone a sense of the scale of the problem, which is that we're adding about 51 gigatons of greenhouse gases to the atmosphere every year, and really need to cut that down to zero, which is really a daunting task for either country and the world to tackle. And so China currently accounts for about 30% of global CO2 emissions. And it's estimated that this entails a $16 trillion clean energy infrastructure investment opportunity by 2060, which will generate about 40 million new jobs. So let's see, here's a good chart that illustrates that. And renewable energy, I believe, is one of the biggest opportunities here, leading to about 50% of the decarbonization process in China. It's also estimated that China's renewable power generation, which is led by solar, as we can see from the second chart, led by solar, wind, nuclear, and hydro, which China's heavily investing into now. And this will triple by 2060. And also another trend that we're seeing is clean hydrogen, which has also been cited to drive about 20% of the decarbonization process, if, of course, hydrogen can be stabilized and stored in a safe way. So I've been spending the past 6 years of my career thinking about the nexus between finance and technology and how we can better utilize finance to support innovation, emerging technologies that are contributing towards a more sustainable future. To give you an idea of the current breakdown of our current global emissions, and this is how we're thinking about our kind of investment sectors. So currently manufacturing, for example, steel, plastics, cement, that accounts for about 31% of total global emissions. And then also the second broad category is electricity and power generation. So, as we're seeing the digitization of everything, data usage, with increasing need for connectivity, the rise of blockchain and cryptocurrencies, that currently accounts for about 27% of total global emissions. Another area that I'm heavily kind of tracking and investing in is food and agricultural technologies. So food and agriculture, that accounts for about almost 20% of global emissions. And then we're looking at transportation. So that's planes, trucks, cargo ships, and that accounts for about 16%. And the rest is really in kind of heating, cooling, refrigeration. So I think that gives you a sense of where we need to tackle in terms of technologies, industries. So when I was at the US-China Green Fund, which is now the Asia Green Fund, I was part of the founding team. We really thought deeply about how governments, industry, academia, nonprofits, and individuals can work together to come up with better solutions to address climate change, and really without a political agenda. So as I've witnessed a trend for more institutions and funds directing capital into sustainable businesses and strategies, both in public and private markets. Our thesis was that by investing in technologies and business models that impact our daily lives, we can really gradually change people's behavior and adoption of clean technologies. And this involved the following sectors, which I think align well also with the SDGs. So first, clean energy and energy efficiency. So we're looking at infrastructure, adoption of renewable energy, solar panels, wind infrastructure, and buildings, which is also a large part of emissions, as well as contributes greatly to environmental impact. So, and if you think about it, that's where we spend the majority of our time, inside buildings. And so we're thinking about how structures can be built using more energy efficient sources, as well as more efficient data centers to prepare for a digital future. The next sector is green manufacturing. So this is the bulk of where our current greenhouse gas emissions are generated. So with more investment into CCS technology, we can capture carbon more efficiently and reduce our use of materials and resources during the production process. On the environmental front, I think it's also crucial to fund technologies that are addressing air, water, and soil pollution, as these are, I think, basic necessities that we often take for granted. The next sector is mobility and logistics. This is an area where I believe more innovation and investment into infrastructure is important. So the US has already announced that by 2030, 50% of all vehicles will have to be electric, which forces car manufacturers to innovate and rethink their future models. And in addition, with increasing convenience, so much packaging is used on a daily basis, creating more waste. So we invested in a company that recycles industrial packaging and uses smart logistics software. So these are some of the ideas we're thinking about, and then also, you know, as a means to drive impact investing. And then finally, on the consumption front, both the US and China are investing into the circular economy, sustainable products and services, food and agricultural technologies, which I'll elaborate a bit more later, as well as changing consumer perceptions and behavior. So on the VC and private equity side, we are seeing that more capital is being deployed towards climate technologies, and we see a lot of cross-border investments into both the US and China. For example, in the past year and a half, my family office has been tracking developments and investing into food and agriculture technologies that are addressing some of the most pressing challenges for the need to meet global demand for food and protein. So just wanted to, right. So the World Bank estimates that global population may grow to 10 billion people by 2060. So that's a daunting task to be able to supply so many people with healthy and nutritious food. And there will be increasing strains on land resources, pollution, water, the impacts of climate change. And as we know, protein is critical to human health. So an estimated 795 million people, and this is almost exclusively in developing countries, were suffering from chronic undernourishment. And at the same time, more than 2 billion people are overweight or obese, and overall consumption exceeds the nutritional need in many of the developing countries. And so the demand for animal protein is growing rapidly due to urbanization, rising incomes. However, protein consumption is predicted to nearly double by 2050, with marine-based proteins gaining a growing market share. So not only will this increase in production present a major challenge in terms of negative impacts on soil, water, and biodiversity, but it will also have a range of negative health impacts. So overconsumption of meat-based protein is linked to rising levels of obesity, type 2 diabetes, heart disease, which is a leading cause of death in many countries now. And so as we're thinking about it comprehensively, businesses and governments and civil society are increasingly waking up to the implications of this projected increase in plant-based protein and associated risks. So in the past 10 years, there's been a revolution in the creation of alternative proteins from plant-based ingredients such as soy, gluten, pea, corn, and fungi. So we've also seen major investments in companies such as Impossible Foods and Beyond Burger, which went public in 2019. So now we can find a number of plant-based meat, dairy, and other products in the grocery stores with a lot of variety and flavors. This is a sector that I'm personally very excited about. Even during the pandemic in 2020, we saw a significant increase in the amount of plant-based foods being consumed. And in the US alone, that market reached to over $7 billion. So, and this industry is projected to grow at a CAGR of 14%, reaching about 290 billion by 2035. That's a staggering number. And among these, we're seeing large increases in plant-based milk, plant-based meats, and then other, and dairy as well. So it's a promising market given the new trends in sustainable lifestyles. And this is a sector that I think has a lot of potential to grow, especially since we are feeding a growing world population. And the key is to make it affordable and also nutritious. So as I mentioned, this is just one sector I'm excited about. I also wanted to kind of shift my focus a little bit now to something that's a little bit more personal. So I wanted to include some images that really evokes sentiment of how we're looking at our environment today. And this is something that I personally have been involved in. I mean, I as Max mentioned, I grew up with a grandfather who I really looked up to. He was the most environmentally conscious person I knew. He would refuse to ride in cars so much that he had fallen while riding a bike on the streets of Beijing twice, sent to the hospital, and he would use the water he used for cooking to wash things and then flush the toilet. I mean, he left no valuable resources wasted. So when I became an adult, I think that, and this applies to a lot of us on the panel and in the audience. So innovation and industrial manufacturing had rendered goods to be so affordable and widely available that we forgot the environmental costs of producing plastic and single-use containers. Thus, we can see the amount of waste and pollution that has been produced, and so much of the air, soil, and water pollution. So like many of us, we've given in to the convenience of purchasing everyday goods, coffee here, takeout for lunch, mass packaging, plastic utensils that end up in landfills. So it wasn't until 5 years ago that I was exposed to the concept of zero waste and how my individual actions are impacting the environment. So when I had learned about people who are able to store 2 years of trash in one small jar that we see in the middle, I went from producing several single-use waste items on a daily basis to always using my own water bottle, bringing my own utensils, enforcing different types of recycling and food waste bins at the office. And then I even compost now. So I've learned that this significant shift in consciousness allowed me to really recognize the impact of my behavior. When I was at the Asia Green Fund, I took responsibility towards running our corporate foundation. So building a nonprofit that focused on environmental education and action. So we put together programs for elementary to high school students, corporations, as well as residential communities to raise awareness for individual environmental actions. And thus that influenced more people's perceptions of their role in the product cycle and how they can reduce their waste and environmental impact. So let me just share some photos. I really thought it was such a rewarding process to go into schools and teach kids about being environmental, I found that they were the most receptive. Adults, I mean, we already have formed behaviors, but the kids are so eager to adapt a lot of these practices. And as part of their homework, we encourage them to share the information with their families, in turn kind of influencing family behavior on recycling and other types of more environmentally friendly practices. So I know it's difficult to change people's perceptions, which will then lead to concrete action, but it's important to practice what you preach. So I think this has a lot of synergies with Max's platform as well, with Carbonbase, and look forward to helping people quantify their carbon and environmental footprint and contributing towards a sustainable future.
Thank you so much, Annie, for such a wonderful set of remarks, and really loved how you brought together both the really big macro, the large global trends, as well as the personal actions that we can individually take and start elevating our own level of consciousness. Especially, I think being able to quantify the amount of waste we produce, I think is a very telling and perhaps eye-opening experience as well. So really appreciate your work in education, investment, and also governmental sectors as well. I want to give the floor now to Professor Cary Krosinsky. You have a new book that came out in the last few months, and it talks about modern China. It looks a lot actually at the conceptions that we have in the West about what China's policies are, what China's strategies are, and also maybe cast a fresh perspective on that lens. Do you want to say a few words about what you learned writing the book, and also what you hope people can learn from diving into the book itself? You might be on mute, Professor.
Yeah, thank you, Max. Great to be with you all, and I'll keep my remarks brief so we can get into the Q&A as quickly as possible. But just quickly to say, I really loved your presentation, Annie. Great to be back with you. It's just if you're up for speaking to one of our classes on what you just talked about, that would be most welcome. I actually think engaging with students is one of the most important things we can all do. And I think if I had to pick the two most impactful things we could do, one would be engaging with students. The other would be building better U.S.-China relations, because as Max said, we came out with our book last year, which was our 7th, and we've been very disturbed by the destruction, as it were, of the U.S.-China relationship, which has really taken place over the last few years. We hosted an event in Shenzhen. We actually had the U.S.-China Green Fund at the event, which was great. And at the time we were wondering, well, is there really a trade war, or is Donald Trump just negotiating what's actually going to happen? And so much has changed between early 2019 and now, and it's really unfortunate, because we really do need to solve societal challenges together, whether they're impact investing challenges or climate change. Why do we not share the best innovations with each other so that they can be scaled? We had Secretary Kerry in one of our Yale classes actually in April 2019, and he, this is before obviously the most recent election and his new role. He was quite upset that the U.S.-China relationship had been degraded. He's the one who built the U.S.-China relationship leading up to the Paris Agreement, and he was quite convinced that the U.S. and China, for example, could partner and invest in the developing world to scale up renewable energy, something that's particularly hard when you think about countries across Africa or across Asia. So this is important work that remains to be done. And our book was an attempt to try to clarify what's really happening in China. I think for many Americans and many in the West, China is a bit of a mystery unless you've had a chance to actually engage and get to know the wonderful people, the culture, and the last 40 years of economic success have to be looked at and respected. And while there are differences, we've been pretty unhappy with the current administration's approach to the U.S.-China relationship, to be very frank. I don't really understand it. I could take a guess as to what's motivating it, but I think that the U.S. should be showing more respect to China and the way it's developed and the way it's actually trying to tackle its carbon challenges. Obviously, we had President Xi yesterday announcing that no more coal would be financed outside of China. That was a very exciting announcement, and one that now special climate advisor Kerry rightly applauded. And so all of these efforts are just so important. We can't be innovating in isolation and not scaling the good ideas we all find together. There may be differences, but those could be overcome. We can figure out how to do technology together if we put our minds to it. China and the U.S. not long ago were considered 1 and 1A. And I'd love to see us get back to that, because I just think to solve climate, it's going to require all hands on deck. We like to talk about 5 pillars of what's needed. Corporations need to do more, investors need to do more, policy needs to support that. Consumers need to make better choices. To Annie's point, in our own research, we think corporations are about 1/3 of the global footprint, and people and their choices are about 2/3. So it is really important that everyone acts in tandem. And the 5th pillar is innovation. So it's great that thoughtful people like Annie are investing in these solutions. We actually helped start a newsletter called Climate Tech VC last year by introducing 2 amazing young women, Sophie Purdom and Kim Zhu, and that's become a big success. So if we can push on all 5 of those pillars at the same time as hard as we can, we have a chance of solving these problems. We're going to need to invest trillions and trillions of dollars, and I think that's going to take further creative thinking on how to not just have the BRI come out of China, but how can the U.S. get involved? How can Europe get involved? How can we build investment solutions together and maybe think about some creativity along the way? I have some further thoughts on that as well. Anyway, it's been a fascinating journey to try to host an event in China about the future of sustainable finance and see so much change in the last few years. I think we need to get to a point where we're cooperating more. The first chapter of our book was called The Cooperation Imperative, and it was excerpted in the Stanford Social Innovation Review. And we're continuing to work with large global pension funds and university endowments, trying to help them advance their thinking. So I'd look forward to our further discussions as a panel, but I'd just love to see us fulfill what Secretary Kerry said in our class, and it's rebuild the U.S.-China relationship for the sake of the world.
Thank you so much, Kerry. And before we kind of have, ranging questions, I'd just love to give Colin a chance to share a few thoughts as well. Colin, yesterday, President Xi actually at the UNGA made the announcement that China would no longer be funding coal-fired power plants abroad. And someone who actually knows the ins and outs of power development, intricately, how do you sort of see the last maybe 20 or so years of China's increase in its energy production capacity, and now a very aggressive change towards decarbonization and new energy source development?
Well, thank you, Max, and thank you for Carbonbase inviting me to participate in this great panel. What a story, a family story and personal story that Anne have presented, on her journey towards a more sustainable world. It gave me a lot of encouragement and admiration of what she and her family have done. And likewise with Professor Krosinsky, that they been relentlessly working on, promoting the Chinese-U.S. relationship, especially in the sustainability effort. I don't think the world can do to achieve any climate change goal without China's earnest participation. But I have a little personal encouragement for everybody here today that in my almost 30 years of experience working in the energy sector in Asia, particularly in China, there's one thing that I have to say. When China set a goal in doing something, especially in energy reform, that area that I'm very familiar with, it might look discouraging at the beginning, but ultimately they achieved the goal. And I see that the professor is knocking his head, agreeing with my observation, but I'm speaking from personal experience in the area that I participate in. And China have really not missed their goal, in many cases ahead of time. So I hope that this time they would do likewise. And I'm particularly very encouraged to hear what President Xi have to say. And I personally also know that in working in the sector, that the order from the commander in China have really already reaching down to the working level, right? Down to the district, officers, down to the mayor, and down to the governor of the province. And I myself, of course, have participated, for the first 20 years in my career in Asia in building traditional, and i.e. many of them are actually coal-fired power plant. But our team were proud that we make a contribution to the economic development and the energy needed, for getting a lot of the poor people out of poverty. So, but I also, and our team, as well as our shareholder behind us, also know that, recognize that time has come for us to move into the renewable sector, into a more sustainable factor, so that we have now moved into a developing waste to energy plant that will convert municipal solid waste into hydrogen, and we are moving into renewable, and we have built solar plant and power plants, and we hope that we would be able to continue to this kind. And today I am very happy to participate in this panel, and hope that I can learn a lot more from the Q&A section. I already learned a lot from the remarks of the two previous speakers. Back to you, Mac.
Thank you so much, Colin. And I will just launch into have heard from some of our speakers that we may be able to have their time for a bit longer after 10 o'clock. So depending on people's schedules, we will try to go to 10:30. And obviously our speakers have their own schedules to keep. But for the audience participation, this is a chance to encourage you guys to write more questions into the chat, and we'll try to answer them as we go through. So the first question I have is, what is really the biggest roadblocks to having a productive U.S.-China relationship when it comes to climate change? And I'll preface this with a little context. So from an outsider's perspective, the U.S. in the last 4 years, with President Donald Trump's at the helm, has taken a very retrograde attitude towards the recognition and actions towards climate change. And in that same time period, China has tried to establish, very large incentives for EVs, for renewable power development, and other kind of sector incentives. And today, with President Biden in the White House, there's now renewed interest on both, these two countries about the recognition of the importance of this action. What is preventing the two countries from coming to a more cordial or perhaps productive terms in this sort of particular stance? Does anyone want to go first? Maybe Kerry can go first.
Yeah, maybe I'll just give an observation, and it might actually help answer partly the question that was, I think, placed in the Q&A by an anonymous attendee also. And this is an educated guess, but early in 2020, when Biden was starting his campaign to potentially be the Democratic candidate for president, he made a comment which is easily found on Google or whatever search you can find, that China was not a threat. He wasn't worried about China, and he got a lot of pushback for that. This was, I think, February 2020, not long ago. My sense, without knowing completely, is that there's a thought that with Congress being such an important factor as to what actually gets passed as law in the United States, that the two parties here, the Democratic and Republican Party, are positioning themselves for the next election. And unfortunately, China's become a bit of a political football, which is really unfortunate. Rather than taking the time to educate people about what's really happening in China, trying to build a better relationship, there's a fear that if you're seen as weak on China, you'll lose voters and lose the next election. And that's my sense, is that some computer algorithm is spitting out what things to say about certain subjects, including China. And it's helped further damage the relationship, in my opinion, even since the previous administration's, arguably racist approach to China. So just to be frank, my sense is that once the primary and the election season are underway, and that now with positioning for what's not far away, the next election, that there's a fear of being seen as weak on China and losing voters and losing the next election, informing the positioning that we hear, and hopefully behind the scenes, people are thinking differently. But anyway, I don't know if that's helpful, but this is why, for me, the most important thing we can do on a global basis is some of the things that Annie was talking about: build a global consensus to act on climate and help build a better relationship, because between those two things, we can do a lot together. And we have to get beyond this political rhetoric and the political thinking.
Thank you, Kerry. Annie, do you want to weigh in on a bit, from conversations you have with the, finance and investment community? Do they have a, attitude change about, investing in renewables or investing in kind of sustainable development in China, seen different from maybe two or 3 years ago?
Sure. I actually want to opine on Kerry's point, which I agree with to some extent, and also I think that the U.S.-China relationship has really been on a downhill trend since the Trump, I would say, at the end of the Obama administration, and then transitioning into the Trump administration. Initially, I think it was just managing expectations. The US having this rhetoric towards China, and China thinking that Trump was an inexperienced politician who's someone they could manipulate or influence. However, when Trump, I think, came up, deemed China to be talked about the trade war, I think that really set the tone for the relationship going forward. And I worked closely with those in the U.S. administration at the U.S. Embassy in Beijing at the time, many of whom I thought were kind of a little bit more diplomatic in terms of encouraging a collaborative relationship, but some of whom have shared with me personally that they thought this was long overdue, that the US had to be tougher on China and call it out on trade issues, on some of the economic and industrial espionage that we were seeing, right? So we saw a continuous kind of downhill trend in terms of mistrust between the two countries, which needs to be rebuilt in order to encourage a more cohesive kind of climate dialogue. I think that, even if the US and China don't agree on certain other things like cybersecurity or like essential industries like semiconductors, they do now find some common ground on the issue of climate and environment. And so I think that that relationship needs to be further honed and built out. And then also in terms of long-term kind of finding areas of, let's say, mutual investment I think both countries can agree on, to your point, Max, renewable energy, building out the infrastructure. I think there's a lot of opportunities there. And then also, I think, both countries are exploring hydrogen. And besides the energy space, they're also looking at, let's say, more sustainable manufacturing processes, carbon capture technologies, and also the electric vehicle kind of infrastructure, right? So storage, batteries, I think these are all areas where we can come to some sort of consensus, and hopefully we can see more collaborative efforts between the two countries.
Thank you, Annie. Colin, do you have some thoughts on the potential rift factors that sort of sit between US and China?
Well, I'm a Chinese American, so coming to US-China relationship and cooperation kind of put me in a very interesting position. I have to say that on the environmental matters and the sustainability investment, I'm disappointed about what my own country have done. They really turn everything into politics more than actual activities. So I'm sort of happy to see that the private sector beginning to understand that they cannot rely on the government, the US government, to save the world anymore. But I'm still disappointed their action plan are not quite strong enough or quite big enough. So for a entrepreneur that is struggling to raise fund for some new technology, to raise fund to build, or introduce new technology that can promote sustainability, in urban living. We're very happy working with Max team, on some of this decarbonization, effort, and we are working very hard to come up with a new transitional energy to replace or offset the traditional fossil fuel, energy base. So I think that we still have a long way to go, and the Biden administration, as well as any future US administration, will have to really commit a lot more, and the US financial community will have to do a lot more. The so-called green financing advantages they're trying to provide it is far from enough, right? If you ask any entrepreneur who try to raise money to do the right thing, they'll tell you that the reduction in interest rate or the other incentive are quite not enough.
Yeah, thank you, Colin. And with that, we'll sort of slightly transition the topic, because I think one of the interesting historical pieces has been that, in the last 40, 50 years of Chinese modern development, actually the US has played, quite a significant role. Colin actually told me a personal story where one of the first ever investments in a Chinese power station was facilitated by his personal efforts with US capital. And I think if we look at the modern China story, despite a lot of the energy being produced by coal, China's economic development also was responsible for meeting the Millennial Development Goals of the UN, being able to bring, significant numbers of people out of a very low standard of living into a prosperous environment. And today there's still a few billion more people who yet to rise above the, absolute poverty line. And those people are actually the most ill-suited to receive the effects of, severe weather patterns and also adverse climate effects. And I think one of the challenges that we would face perhaps is, if we ignore all of the intricate history that ties the two countries to each other, and we sort of, come to a very hard-nosed negotiation today, we sort of lose a lot of the existing relational capital that has been accumulated. And I wonder if if any of the panelists think that the energy race, right, the ability to produce renewable power could actually mirror something like a space race or like other types of industrial build-up race. But now it's about who gets to control the resources that make renewable batteries or hydrogen production and these kind of factors. Colin, do you have a thought? Maybe we can start with you first. As someone who's sort of seen a lot of the traditional fossil development and then also now building new technologies in hydrogen, do you think that there could be what does the competition landscape look like between the US and China for energy? And do you see that being fought on like trade wars or on tax or importation kind of controls? And is there sort of natural advantages that these two countries have when it comes to mineral deposits or sort of fuel availability?
Well, I certainly believe that there is a lot of things that we can do and we need to do in order to break the ice. The one example that I have been looking at is that when I tried to build my first wind power plant in China, that's almost 15 years ago. And even with the heavy subsidies of the Chinese government, right, a tremendous subsidies, I would not have been able to build a plant if not because of the CDM credit, right, which is the carbon credit program under the Kyoto, Convention. And overall, I can tell everybody that without this program, and by and large, with the European Union's, are subsidizing the wind power development in China. Right? Many of the wind power plants will have never been able to build. But look at what happened, right? That program not only helped China develop, and lower the cost of wind power plants, it now make the wind power technology available to other developing countries, right, including Europe, at a very competitive price. Right, a new solar power plant, new wind power plant do not need government subsidized anymore. They are in par with the coal-fired power plant. Now, who would have thought of that? Okay? If we don't take the lead, Germany pay a huge price, economic price, for developing their renewable industry, right? But now they would people can see the benefit, right? Not only to themselves, but it will be having the lower solar technology, cost technology developed that will be available to the rest of the world. So I would hopefully that the particular the leading wealthy countries in the world can take a longer range look, right, and not worry about tomorrow or next year's return on the investment. And that's my personal advice to thinking that whoever comes with a way to change that the mindset of the financial sector, it will be what you need to break the ice.
Thank you, Colin. I wonder if Kerry or any of you guys want to chime in on energy development, just from your particular.
Sure, I can add a brief thought, which is I think we all remember, but sometimes maybe we forget that China's rush to develop solar panels and has actually helped dramatically lower the cost curve of solar to the point where it is economically viable here in the US. We have solar panels on our house, and we're paying less for our energy than we used to. And so to Colin's point, there's a big opportunity to work together, and that's a great case study of how China can help the world improve its economic choices. In many countries, this will be hard. Indonesia, Malaysia, where coal is still the cheapest option. So can we use case studies and try to figure out country by country how we can help accelerate renewable energy take-up by changing the economics and making it not onerous on those countries where they still have energy poverty and poverty alleviation isn't solved, unlike to some measures in China. So I think sometimes we lose sight of the economics of the energy transition, and that and I'm completely in alignment with Colin that the opportunity is to work together using economics to try to help facilitate the transition in creative ways. So it's a great example of how the U.S. and China should be working together more and try to build a relationship with respect and cooperation that does that together. I think that would be just so super important. And the alternative is to work in isolation, and we'll make less progress the more isolated we are, because we just won't have that opportunity to help each other and help other nations.
Thank you. Okay.
Yeah, just to chime in quickly, I agree with Colin and Kerry with regard to some of the solutions that we have, but I think it's important to note the differences between the two economies or two political systems. I think someone asked a question about that, and I think that in terms of how we've seen rapid development in China because of the one-party system, because the central government has such a strong mandate to kind of, and China's always had a planned economy, right? So we see the 5-year plans, and that translates into concrete actions for the provincial and city governments, local governments. And I think that has helped China not only advance, but has also really contributed deeply to all the environmental issues and challenges that we're seeing today. And we have seen sort of outcry from the public with regard to the worsening air pollution and food contamination, all the things that came from the 40 years of rapid industrial development, right? And President Xi is not breathing different air than the rest of the population. So I think that really drove China's its sentiments, and also the action-oriented policies to change the state of the current kind of environmental standards in China, and to really improve upon manufacturing processes and really addressing the pollution that's there. Whereas compare that to the US, while the federal government has strong mandates, it then kind of trickles down to the state governments. It's up to the state governments to dictate what types of energy or other types of technologies they're using. So of course, with that level of bureaucracy, and also I think it's a matter of educating not only politicians, but the general public about the implications of these technologies on the environment. For example, I think over the years, we couldn't even agree on whether natural gas is a viable kind of cleaner kind of fossil fuel energy, or fracking. And then there's all these environmental groups, right? So there's many more actors at play in the US to influence these kinds of decisions. So I think these pose some of the greater challenges in terms of either countries' decisions to as part of the energy transition or the kind of clean tech infrastructure transition. But in addition, I think what Colin and Kerry mentioned about the economics of it, convincing corporations that the economics actually make more sense, right? That it could be much more affordable, or it's a cheaper solution, right? I think that as we kind of get ourselves comfortable with that and educate the public about what that means in terms of dollars, or in terms of policies, what they have to do, and get it down to more concrete actions, I think that will help with the process for both countries.
Thank you so much, Annie. So we're going to transition to Q&A very shortly, but I just want to take an opportunity to ask a slightly different track of the opportunity for collaboration. And so we've talked about the energy development and energy infrastructure needs, but I also want to mention the cultural needs. So as we look at the new ways of living in the post-COVID and post-climate change world, we need to change perhaps how we actually approach our material consumption, our definition of GDP growth, and also our aspirations. And I think opportunity to see, can there be alternative models for what it means to live a good life, in addition to the one that we've been driving on, maybe perhaps powered by, example, the American dream, the one house, two cars, and two children in the suburbs. And as many urban centers of around the world develop, especially in currently developed regions, that dream doesn't necessarily seem to be the most applicable to their ability to build a better life while also keeping underneath the bounds. We've seen one example come from the donut economics perspective, where there's now two rings, right? One ring that actually sort of underscores your delivery of base needs, and another ring that actually caps potentially consumption and says we need to consume within this boundary in order to not overuse the resources on the planet. Are there examples from Asian culture, Chinese culture, or Chinese past models of life that could offer a way to live in a post-climate change world?
I think that some example that Annie just mentioned in her opening remark is something that I think we need to think about. To me, educating the kid and hoping that you will change their mindset about the environment, about the sustainability would be the only way to go in the long run. Right? In the meantime, we have to do other things, like I say, in the financing side, in the technology cooperation side. There's no reason for US and China to come at each other, right, on technology side, because technology as get advanced, it doesn't matter it came from Germany or US or China, it's going to benefit everybody, right? It doesn't matter where it started, right? It's going to end up benefiting to the whole world in the aggregate, right? So I think we should put that aside. But for the long term, I remember how we tried to tackle the smoking problem. I remember that how we tried to tackle the pollution problem in the US, right? We educate the kid, what is the right thing to do. They go home and they teach the parents or stop the parents from doing the wrong thing. So I think education is going to be a very important thing that we want to do as a world.
Maybe I can just briefly add to that. I think too much attention's been paid to the impact of fossil fuel production. There's a lot of noise about divestment. Fossil fuel production is just 10 to 15% of the annual carbon emissions. It's the actual use of fossil fuel where we have these figures that Annie was talking about earlier, 50 to 60 gigatons of carbon and carbon dioxide equivalent being emitted every year that we need to reduce. We can only reduce that really. It's fine to do methane efficiency, but changing the transportation mix, that's where one of the big opportunities is. Changing the energy mix that is used to generate electricity, maybe figuring out ways to create local energy more and more because of the loss that occurs in energy transmission. That's like 2/3 of energy that gets produced, just gets lost. And then of course we have industrial process and the impact of buildings and agriculture and deforestation and land use. So if we push on these levers really hard, then with the global technologies that emerge, and they will emerge everywhere. Innovation it's laboratory specific. We should be thinking about building that roadmap for helping people make better choices, giving them the options to not lose quality of life in making those choices, having those choices be more economic for themselves and their families, and healthier as well. And there'll be more jobs created as we enter a world of I think, I find the phrase common prosperity an exciting phrase myself, because we're going to have more robotics and China's going to have less people. How do we, this could actually be a real positive for the economy of the world as we get more efficient. But we need to be mindful of all of these things. And if we get a global consensus to act, it will be because enough people see that it will be beneficial to them and themselves and their families to act, and that we need to do this together. And so individual choices are important, but we also need this sort of individual choice to act together as well.
Yeah, I completely agree with what Colin and Kerry had mentioned in terms of individual actions, but driven by kind of a common consensus over what's actually good for the planet and for this common prosperity. I think a lot of the solutions that I talked about before, by no means are they kind of the final, Max had asked, what about this one house, two cars? I mean, in the future, maybe just one net zero house and two electric vehicles, right? I mean, maybe that is the future that we're looking at in terms of, what I mentioned, where manufacturers, engineers and infrastructure, I mean, that's all changing towards consumer kind of demands, right? If we're not buying the previously kind of unsustainable types of goods and services, that means that manufacturers have to innovate and kind of transition towards more sustainable materials, practices, and products they're actually creating. Right. So, for the consumer, I think it's about educating the public. It's about understanding kind of global needs for the transition. It's about kind of quelling the rhetoric that's out there, right? Not pointing the finger at each other, labeling China or labeling the U.S. as kind of just putting the blame on someone else, right? So I think it's really about like all the countries working together on a global scale to tackle these challenges and to change public perceptions about how this more resilient future would look like.
Thank you so much, Annie. And with that, we'll just kind of turn to some of the very active audience questions we've been receiving. And I'll try to batch them into a few kind of topics as well, but I think some of you guys see ones addressed to yourself. So the first one is about the ice break. So this is something that both I think Kerry mentioned and also Colin mentioned. What could be an ice break point to start more meaningful forms of collaboration in this current climate? Can there be kind of a small win that US and China can both celebrate and be happy about, that can sort of change the general dynamic between the two countries? And questions open to anyone for thoughts.
Maybe I'll just start this one briefly. There's three things I haven't mentioned that I think all could apply. So we actually started something called the US-China Better Relations Coalition, or UCBRC. The idea was to try to bring students together to just get along, and as they do at universities such as where I teach at Brown this semester, and at Yale and NYU also. We'd love to see businesses join such a coalition and start to work together, maybe create safe spaces to tackle the challenging sectors where they could actually work together on technology and stop having this antagonistic relationship that's just not beneficial. So that's one. I think that's one mechanism. One mechanism is to either leverage existing coalitions like that or build a new coalition. I mean, this was the whole point of the U.S.-China Green Fund, as Annie will well know, to try to take innovation where it's happening and bring it cross-border. This was, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, the vision of Hank Paulson, who's long been trying to get the two nations to work together. So that's one thing. Another thing, we're actually working with China's largest index provider, CSI, to help develop a better ESG framework, one that actually accounts for what my fellow panelists have been talking about, the idea that China can just get on with it. And actually, when the government gets its mind behind something and it meets its goals, and actually that, from an ESG perspective, that should be considered an advantage. Whereas the U.S. has this political football situation that makes it less likely that there'll be renewable energy technology incentives. It makes it harder. And so an ESG framework should account for that on a country by country basis. So that's another way that we can help, is to clarify where progress can come and who's best positioned to deliver it. And another is to have, the third thing I wanted to quickly say is that in addition to teaching at universities, we actually launched our own sustainable finance certification designation, CSFA, and we've hosted a few cohorts where we're trying to get students from around the world, from China, from Hong Kong, from Australia, Singapore, Malaysia, Indonesia, Europe, and here in the United States, to come together and work on the sustainable finance challenges together, advance their work. We've actually created a coalition of large pension funds and endowments that's not public, and we're doing the same thing. So, as China, builds out its pension system and provides, services for the elderly, you can learn from what's happening around the world, and vice versa. We can learn from how China has advanced its economy so quickly, and to its great credit. So those are three quick ideas.
Thank you, Kerry. I love how actionable and action-oriented you are. Like a lot of people say there's a problem, it's kind of sitting here, you're just, starting with the solutions immediately. So thank you for all of those efforts, and we love to support. I'm sure many audiences here love to, participate and find ways to engage with each of these amazing initiatives you just mentioned.
Well, I believe a lot of the obstacles for U.S.-China to cooperate more is really rests on the political situation, and I myself am not an expert in that, and I'm actually personally my idea of the future that this political problem can be resolved in the short term not very great. I'm actually not optimistic on that. So absent of that, solving the political problem, the best as a businessman and as a industry petition, I think that we can just keep our head down and do what we think is the right thing to do. And hopefully by our own little bit action, we can contribute in making achieving the goal a little bit better. One thing I have not heard we talk about yet is instead of thinking about switching from fossil fuel to a more renewable thing, we have not talked about how about using less, instead of supplying more. And because to me, a kilowatt hour not used is a lot better than a cleaner kWh being produced, right? So in that, I would like to see that the financial sector and the industrial sector putting more effort into the technology in that area. Who say that we have to have 2 cars per family to live a good life? If public transportation are getting better, or if a driverless, transportation system can be in place, and with the internet technology, with the IoT devices advancing, I think those are all within our grasp to make it happen. I think that may be so. From my perspective, absent from the political solution, I think the technology solution and the mindset of the people and our living style would have to become more important.
I'm just going to press on with some other questions because we have a few we want to get through. So one of the really interesting questions, there's two that sort of, I'm combined together. The first is saying, as a developing country that's, not required to take as much responsibility according to the CBDR, what is the drive for China to achieve such an immensely challenging, carbon neutral and carbon peaking goal for 2030 and 2060? Is it political? Is it economic? Is it some other consideration? And then the other side of the question, which I think is mentioned slightly later, is actually a notion of responsibility. Who should be taking how much responsibility? From a snapshot perspective, today, China is 30% of global emissions. That is a fact. But from a historical cumulative emission perspective, China is about half of what the total US emissions actually is. And Europe's cumulative emissions also is quite substantial. So where do we measure the responsibility to cut emissions? Is it only measuring on today? Is it measuring historically? And how do we sort of how do we reach consensus about that act of responsibility?
Maybe I'll raise my hand to go first, but either of my panelists should chime in. I don't mean to be the kid in class who always raises their hand, but yeah, there's a few things to say about this. First of all, actually, we had one of the conclusions of our Modern China book was that we should try to think about nations in a new way. I understand the technical reasons why China wants to still be seen as an emerging market. I don't think many people think of China as an emerging economy anymore, but that's neither here nor there. For me, the way to think about countries they are either mature or they're evolving or they're challenged, and that's a sliding scale, and any country can be seen on that spectrum, and we can understand countries and where they are. And the degree to which they're taking up or able to take up changing their energy mix is a really important bellwether indicator of that. To the other point about historic emissions, I mean, another way of looking at emissions is per capita, right? So obviously China's emissions are much lower if you just look at on a per person basis. So I think we can get stuck on this and figure out, who does what, who should do what based on what, the past or the present. But what's most important is the future. And, ultimately, we need a roadmap of actions that each of the world's 200 countries take. India, for example, has ambitions to also change its energy mix, but they don't really have the money to make the major transition on their own, is my understanding. So I really do think we're going to need to think hard about where this $50 trillion is going to come from for the transition that we need to see. The total value of tradable assets in the world is roughly 500 trillion, and 50 trillion over 20 years or so is doable. It's 10% of the value of everything. It's going to take a combination, I believe, of creative stimulus, some sort of public-private partnership at scale, and investors collaborating to come up with this money. It's not just sitting around waiting to be spent. So I think my opinion, we need to get together and create a realistic global roadmap, a new Manhattan Project, the new Bretton Woods, for figuring out where this money is going to come from, and kind of move beyond these sort of, frankly, GCF bickering that you keep seeing every year at the COP process, which I don't think is very helpful, frankly. We need to move. We need to move from the billions to the trillions and be serious about it.
I mean, one of the things just to highlight there is that there's been the $100 billion mitigation and adaptation fund that the UN sort of, wanted to raise for some time and still hasn't been able to fully raise yet, right? And in the meantime, I think the total country level stimulus that we see, for COVID and for other economic stuff is actually way larger. It's a different order of magnitude than that 100 billion. So this does seem to be a strong need to maybe inject or mobilize more capital into that space. I was just going to do 2 rapid fire questions as well, and then see if anyone wants to look at or address any other question you sort of want to speak to. One is about finance. So in your book, Kerry, there's a interesting case study of Yihong Capital as a Chinese social impact private equity and venture capital firm. Do you sort of see there being an increase in climate focused investments, right? And changing the perhaps investor appetite as well, what people want to invest in that's maybe more mission aligned in addition to purely return driven.
Yeah, I'll say something quickly, but then I'll look to my panelists also, especially I think they're both at this question. One of the trends we're seeing is this rise up of climate tech VC. So it's now about $30 billion, and it's a field that really didn't exist 2 years ago for the most part. Other than some pretty small efforts. We had a few PE and VC funds at our event in China, trying to encourage more of that work, and that's where we saw the activity. And I think we're also seeing some of the larger traditional private equity managers like Sequoia and the others who've been successful in China, really starting to look at this in a serious way. So, and this cuts across all sectors, categories of innovation, software. Max is, that sort of work you're doing, and this is very exciting. And it's a free newsletter, Climate Tech VC. They're tracking the trends, and so yeah, we're definitely starting to see this transformation where not long ago people in the private equity space would have been like, oh, don't even think about it, this will never happen, we're busy making money, but it is starting to happen. And we have former students who are the head of decarbonization at private equity firms. They're looking for, they can't write a ticket big enough to actually move the money to where the decarbonization is needed. So you need these sort of VC startup efforts to start to succeed and achieve scale in all sorts of categories, so that PE players can now write the bigger tickets. And I think that's what success will look like. But I'm very curious to see what my panelists also think.
Yeah, I just wanted to comment that I think it's an exciting time for venture capital and PE activity. I think if we're talking about kind of the evolution of impact-oriented funds, and especially in China, I mean, the US and Europe have been doing it for years, but in China, really, we're seeing in the early 2000s, we're seeing firms like Qing Capital really tackling some of the climate and environmental kind of and other social impact kind of investments. And then you have funds like Dow Ventures, right? Also one of the earlier ones looking at sustainability and impact. And now you have this whole slew of kind of traditional VCs and PEs kind of setting up their impact arms, impact divisions. Really, I think what part of it is to kind of address the 2060 carbon neutrality goals that that President Xi had announced. Also to, of course, curry favor with the regulatory authorities and kind of be aligned with policy. But I think the important development is that a lot of these funds are now actually thinking about impact. So in the past, it was more like, okay, we need to be on the right side of, to be aligned with politics. But now, they are really thinking about how can we utilize our funds towards something a little bit more impact driven. And so now, a trend that we're seeing is that a lot of these VCs and PEs are chasing after the same deals, impact deals, right? So recently, for example, I talked about the alternative protein industry. We've seen so many just kind of VC dollars going into funding some earlier growth stage technologies. A company that we've been following called Nature's Find, they're making kind of fungal-based alternative protein. They just received $350 million in a Series C investment, and then something like I think it was Perfect Day. They also another alternative dairy company. They received 300 million in financing. So we're seeing a lot of that. Just funds chasing after deals, but hopefully, I'm hopeful that a lot of these investment teams are being thorough and diligent about kind of seeing the real impact where their investment dollars can really translate into kind of supporting some of the more innovative companies out there instead of just following some trends.
Colin, any thoughts on, different types of fund formation and sort of investor appetites?
Well, I don't have any further comment on that subject, but I noticed that among some of the questions being raised, one is have something to do with the carbon capture, and I think actually there have been intensive effort between the two countries in sharing the carbon capture and carbon sequestration or storage, technology. There is a program for the last 5 years between US and China. Each year, each country will spend $2 million in organizing 4 trips, or exchange, between two when the US side of the expert come to China, and 2 trips doing the reverse for the expert to exchange technology on this side. Now, unfortunately, the technology at this stage is that capturing the carbon is not that big a deal. Is actually it will cost money, but the technology is there, it can be done. But how to store it is a major problem. In the US, where there are oil fields, and abandoned mines, that you can put the carbon, inside, back in the oil well, that work well, but it's limited to geographical limitation. If your carbon will not capture nearby, you're out of luck. So I think that technology need to be developed that can utilize the carbon captured or turn it back into another energy form, and that will be a circular economy or sustainable way of handling the carbon that were captured. So until that time, using less and producing less carbon will probably be the only solution, and which is what people are doing now, try to replace the fossil fuel energy usage with the renewable energy usage.
Thank you, Colin. We're coming up to the 10:30 mark, so I wanted to see if any other panelists wanted to pick up any questions they saw that they wanted to talk to. I'll just kind of briefly give us the space to do that.
I would like to see government in the world, right, put politics aside and focus on what is needed to sustain the human race, in its development and its prosperity. And I would also like to see the distribution of the financial wealth be more even, like the latest Chinese President Xi Jinping say, let's be rich together, and not just a small portion. People get very rich, and the rest of the people getting more poor. And I think that in that distribution, it will also change the living style. It might be allowing the society to function in a more efficient way, which therefore lower the average energy consumption per person.
Thank you, Colin, for those very, very thoughtful and eloquent remarks. I guess, Annie and Kerry, do you want to give us your kind of concluding thoughts after this very stimulating and quite expansive panel? What you think your hopes of the near future could look like?
Sure. I just wanted to say I really appreciated both Colin and Kerry's remarks throughout this event. I think they were extremely thoughtful, and it makes us realize that it's such a critical time where we're rethinking our collective human evolution, and we have to make tough decisions that drive action and in protecting our ecosystems. So I think, the global pandemic was just a reminder of the fragility of our planet. And it's a time for correction. And it's a time for people waking up to the urgency of the problem. So I'm really grateful for the opportunity to discuss these issues with all of you, and hope to continue this important dialogue.
Really quick from here, yeah, fantastic to be with all of you. I think it's time for us to be more realistic about who we are as nations, as people. China is going to do it. It's going to be what it is, and people in the U.S. have to stop pretending otherwise. And likewise, the U.S. is going to be a strong nation, and we need to respect each other. And actually, I think we can benefit each other by getting back to the 1 and 1A that we were, or co-economic leaders in the world. We have a lot to teach other nations, but if we don't come at that from a position of respect and understanding, then it will be harder. So I look forward to continue to help foster that, and I know my fellow panelists will as well. And so it's great to be with you.
Thank you so much. Well, this kind of wraps up our panel here today. We were 30 minutes over, and really deeply appreciative of our established or premium speakers actually for their time and their preparation. We have a very remarkable opportunity to share the stage here, and also it's a very pivotal time. The next 2 months may actually have implications over the next 2 or 3 decades as we wait for the outcomes to come from the negotiations at COP, and also the pledges from various countries as well. And I think for all of us online here and those watching this for posterity, we really appreciate the incredible work that each one of you guys have done to elevate the consciousness, to share knowledge and education, and also to be pioneering examples of the change that we need to see more of in this world. So thank you so much again, and look forward to continuing this conversation in the future.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys. Bye-bye.